Think about it for a second. Every single animal living in water, from the smallest guppy in a fish tank to the biggest blue whale in the ocean, is facing this constant life-or-death challenge, balancing its internal water and salt levels. If that balance is off, even by a little, it's game over. So how in the world do they pull it off? Well, today, we're diving deep into the amazing biological machinery that solves this fundamental problem of survival.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start with the basic physics of how water moves, which is the key to everything. Then we'll look at the two big strategies animals use, either go with the flow or fight back. And from there, we'll get into some amazing case studies, bony fish, sharks, and even mammals that decided to head back to the ocean.
Okay, first things first. Absolutely everything we're about to talk about hinges on one single powerful principle: osmosis.
Now, the rule itself is surprisingly simple. Water will always move from an area that's less salty or less concentrated to an area that's more salty. It's just trying to even things out, to dilute the saltier side. This is a fundamental law of physics, and every living cell has to deal with it, no exceptions.
So, in a perfect world, a cell is sitting in what we call an isoosmotic solution. That just means the concentration of stuff, like salts and other solutes, is exactly the same on the inside as it is on the outside. Water flows in, water flows out, but the net movement is zero. The cell is stable, it's happy, no drama here.
But what happens if we take that same cell and drop it into the ocean? Suddenly, it's in a hyperosmotic environment. The seawater is way saltier than the cell's insides. And what does water do? Osmosis kicks in, and water just rushes out of the cell, trying to dilute the entire ocean. Of course, it can't, so the poor cell just shrivels up like a raisin.
And yet, the opposite situation is just as bad, if not worse. Let's put that cell in a hypoosmotic environment, like a freshwater pond. Now the cell itself is the salty one. Water from the outside floods into the cell, trying to dilute its contents. The cell swells up like a water balloon, and if it can't handle the pressure, it can literally burst. This brings us to a really crucial point. When we're talking about osmosis, what matters isn't the number of molecules, it's the number of particles. That's the huge difference between molarity and osmolarity. See, a sugar molecule like glucose just floats around as one particle. But a salt molecule like sodium chloride dissolves and breaks apart into two separate particles, a sodium ion and a chloride ion. That means it has double the osmotic power. It has twice the pull on water molecules.
So with these incredibly powerful osmotic forces pushing and pulling water all over the place, life had to evolve a strategy. And when you boil it all down, there were really only two choices on the table.
You can be an osmoconformer. You just go with the flow. You let your internal body fluids match the saltiness of the water around you. The big advantage, it's cheap, energetically speaking. The downside, you become what's called stenohaline. You can only survive in a very narrow range of salinity. Or you could be an osmoregulator. You actively burn energy to control your internal environment, keeping it stable no matter what's going on outside. This is the path most vertebrates, including you and me, took.
Let's dig into these regulators and see how they work. And there's no better place to start than with a typical bony fish out there in the big, salty ocean. Right, so here's the problem. The body of a marine bony fish is way less salty than the seawater it's swimming in. This means it's in a constant crisis. Through its gills, it's always losing precious fresh water to the ocean, and at the same time, salt is constantly trying to invade its body. To put it simply, it's like a person stranded in the desert, constantly dehydrating. So what's its first move? Well, it's pretty logical. If you're losing water, you gotta drink. This fish is constantly drinking seawater. But wait, how do you get fresh water out of salt water? It uses this incredible trick in its gut. It actively pumps sodium ions into the tiny spaces between the cells of the intestine. This creates a tiny, super salty spot, which then pulls water by osmosis out of the gut and into the blood. It's absolutely brilliant.
Okay, but drinking all that seawater creates a new problem, a massive overload of salt. The fish deals with this using these little biological powerhouses in its gills called chloride cells. These things are basically tiny salt cannons. They're packed with pumps that grab sodium and chloride ions from the blood and literally shoot them back out into the ocean, fighting against that huge concentration gradient.
Now, let's take everything we just learned and flip it completely upside down. What happens when that same type of fish lives in the total opposite environment, a freshwater river?
So here, the problems are the exact reverse. The fish's body is now much saltier than the water around it. Instead of dehydrating, it's constantly in danger of flooding with incoming water.
And instead of gaining salt, it's constantly losing its essential body salts to the environment.
And the solution? It's a total 180. First, rule number 1, do not drink the water. Second, its kidneys go into overdrive, producing enormous amounts of really watery dilute urine to just constantly bail out all that excess water. But that still leaves the salt problem. So its gills now have a new job. They act like little scavengers, actively pulling any stray sodium and chloride ions out of the water and into the body, often trading waste products like ammonia to get the job done.
And this comparison just lays it all out so clearly. You have the same basic animal, a bony fish, but it has evolved two completely opposite toolkits to survive. One for the desert of the ocean, and one for the flood of the river. It's just a beautiful example of adaptation.
But hold on, bony fish aren't the only ones who figured this out. Sharks, skates, and rays, the Elasmobranchs, they came up with a completely different and frankly, very clever strategy.
So instead of constantly fighting the ocean, sharks basically said, if you can't beat them, join them. They allow high levels of urea, a waste product for us, to build up in their blood. This makes their internal fluids just as salty as, or even slightly saltier than, the seawater outside. Problem solved, right? No more water loss. They also use another chemical, TMAO, to protect their cells from the urea. But they still absorb salt through their food, so to deal with that, they have a special organ called the rectal gland, which does one job: pump out excess salt.
All right, for our final case study, let's look at a really fascinating group. Animals whose ancestors lived on land, but then decided to go back to the ocean. We're talking about air breathers like sea turtles, seabirds, and whales.
Now, these animals don't have gills, so they aren't leaking water that way, but they still get a big salt load from their food and from swallowing seawater. Marine reptiles and birds came up with one solution: specialized salt glands, usually right in their skulls, that produce an incredibly concentrated salt brine that they basically sneeze or cry out. Marine mammals, like seals and whales, took a different approach. They perfected the kidney, evolving kidneys so efficient they can produce urine that is far, far saltier than seawater, letting them just pee out all their excess salt.
So, we've just covered a whole range of animals, and each one has its own unique answer to the exact same fundamental challenge. Let's just pull it all together really quickly.
You've got your marine bony fish that drink like crazy and pump out salt. Freshwater fish do the opposite. They pee like crazy and absorb salt. Sharks just make themselves salty with urea and use a special gland. And the marine tetrapods? They either use salt glands or super kidneys. Each one is an elegant, engineered solution to the physics of life in water.
And that leaves us with one final big question. All of these regulatory strategies we talked about are incredibly expensive. They burn a ton of energy. So why do it? What was the massive evolutionary payoff for regulating your internal world instead of just conforming? What incredible advantage did animals gain that was worth all that effort? An advantage that ultimately allowed them to conquer just about every single aquatic habitat on this planet.